Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Um, I'll just give a brief introduction about the lab itself, and then I'll introduce both of our speakers for today. So, the Emergent Nonfiction Lab really kind of aims to explore new modes of nonfiction media practice and theory in the context of contemporary regimes of surveillance control and information warfare. From colonial era ethnographic capture to today's algorithmic systems, media forms have long been entangled with structures of state violence and imperial power. These entanglements persist through modern operational regimes and technologies, AI, biometrics, etc., that weaponize forms of mediation for governance and control. So the ENL interrogates these lineages while centering emergent counter-hegemonic media practices and broader theories that resist these dominant and violent logics. Through talks, workshops, and collaborative inquiry, the lab fosters new frameworks for media practice capable of disrupting extractive systems and imagining otherwise. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome our speakers for today, David Gray Widder and Sireesh Gururaja. So David Gray Widder studies how people creating artificial intelligence systems think about downstream harms and the cultural, political, and economic logic shaping these thoughts. He's a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell Tech's Digital Life Initiative and earned his PhD from Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science. Sireesh Gururaja is a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon's Language Technologies Institute. His research focuses on NLP and AI tools that allow users in specialized domains to keep agency in their work. More concretely, he focuses on user customizable on-device models and how to reason their limitations and update them. He's also interested in incentives shaping NLP research, including funding, tooling, and culture. So today they'll be discussing their recent article, Basic Research, Lethal Effects, Military AI Research Funding as Enlistment, which was co-authored with Lucy Suchman. So with that, I'll hand over to David and Sireesh.
Hi, everyone. Patrick, thanks for the introduction. We're both very excited to be here today, presenting a preprint, getting towards the end of getting it done, but we still love your thoughts and love your criticisms and ideas as we continue to develop this work in new work. Next slide, please, Sireesh. As Patrick mentioned, my name's David. I did my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, and Sireesh, who will briefly introduce himself, is also a PhD student there at Carnegie Mellon. And as we'll get into, Carnegie Mellon has a particularly interesting intertwinement with the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. military. And while I was there, I was involved in a lot of activism trying to disrupt recruiting events for military contractors on campus, and saw some of my friends kicked out for similar actions. So I show up today as sort of a scholar and an activist, proudly in both worlds, especially as I'm now thinking towards a future as a professor in a very, very deep red state next year. Sireesh?
Thanks, David, and thanks, Patrick, for the introduction. As you both mentioned, I'm a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon as well. I'm in the Language Technologies Institute that primarily focuses on natural language processing and AI. My research, as Patrick mentioned, focuses on kind of labor-centric impacts of AI. I think there's a really rich body of criticism that talks about how AI impacts the world. I think there's also a lot of uncritical AI work being done, and I aim to sit at that intersection, which is how can we actually build AI that reflects the critical consensus that is developing about its effects.
And Lucy Suchman, our illustrious co-author, not able to join us today, but still very present in this work. Not gonna really introduce her other than say it's been a joy. Sireesh, next slide, please. So this is what our campus at Carnegie Mellon looked like during World War II. A tank on one of the main lawns, the cut in front of the arts building, nurses being trained in front of what was in the women's college, a military marching band, and trenches being dug on our campus. And sort of, this is historical, but that sort of sense of military presence is, at least to me, very much still felt today, and in who funds our research, and sort of the uncritical attitudes towards militarism or towards military presence on campus. Thinking with sort of the flag rising ceremony, if y'all have ever seen one of those, each morning and each night, the ROTC folks, or I think it's Navy ROTC folks, come by and put up and down the flag. And that sort of is the milieu by which I enter this research, wanting to think harder about research funding for universities and for research in general. Next slide, please. In previous work, I've studied, I often study how software engineers, or really just people building technology, think about the downstream impact of what they're creating. In particular, how they choose not to, or what sort of social constructs allow them not to think about the downstream impacts of what they're creating. And I'm particularly interested in the notion of neutral technology, quote unquote neutral technology, or the idea, especially as expressed through the software engineering ideal of modularity, the software engineering ethic of modularity, where in past work in the left there, I've shown how people building modules upstream in the AI supply chain, for example, data sets or pre-trained models, sort of see them as free-floating, as self-contained, and as therefore not sort of entwined with what they're then used for, even when they might know very well what they're used for. That kind of ethical, that would not imply ethical obligations. And as we get into the meat of this talk, we'll sort of see an analogy between general technological neutrality, or the ethic of modularity, and the notion of basic research, the idea that this research is just for the advancement of science writ large, not for any particular nefarious or otherwise ethically perhaps questionable downstream use.
Together, we've also studied some of the incentives that shape NLP as a subfield of AI and as a scientific field more broadly, right? The kind of current, shall we say, chaos about language models with them being kind of injected into everything has a slightly longer history within the field than it does more broadly with things like ChatGPT. And as the field has developed, we wanted to understand, kind of what influences the research we choose to do and what causes the patterns of research that we see emerging and re-emerging to happen. This slide is a timeline that appears in that paper, broadly categorizing kind of the popularity of certain techniques alongside developing trends in the field that our interviewers talked about. And I think the critical detail to note here is that blue line on top, which basically says that 47% of all NLP papers in 2021 cited a language model called BERT. And this is a trend that we expect to see continuing with newer language models like ChatGPT, like GPT-4. And that kind of incredible centralization is new for NLP, right? If you look here on the kind of bar charts on the timeline, the previous extent of centralization, when people talked about everybody working on a certain thing, did not approach remotely the heights that this level of centralization has on corporate tools. But what's important to note is that that centralization in corporate tools are built on a much deeper foundation of DoD ideas. And where that comes from is a time that was before this kind of initial benchmark bonanza, where funding was effectively patient, right? Where you could effectively sign on to do some sort of work, and over the course of a year, you did it or you didn't do it, and it was not ultimately that consequential. However, in the 80s, we see the US Department of Defense, and DARPA in particular, develop a paradigm that is centered around the continuous evaluation of benchmarks, or the continuous evaluation of models on what are called benchmarks, i.e. the same evaluation for every model on something narrowly defined and tightly scoped. And so this focus on DARPA benchmarks really overtook everything, to the point where grants are now described as, oh, you have to evaluate everything on the same metrics every year. And no matter what progress you make in terms of other affordances, ultimately your evaluation comes down to, does the number go up? Are the metrics looking good? Show me the metrics every year.
Yeah, and for those who maybe are interested in this kind of thing, you can think of that previous paper, background work for what we're talking about today, as an oral history of sorts, sort of interviewing folks who have been in the field for a long time and trying to understand how their subfield of AI has sort of changed, developed, been taken over variously. All right, so for today, we're going to dive a little bit further into what specifically does the US Department of Defense want AI for. That is sort of a guiding question for me. Sometimes the answer is they don't know, they just know they want it. And and that's sort of where we now transition into what we're mostly talking about today. Next slide, please. Some of the theoretical backing for our work is thinking with Michael Kahlon and actor network theory, what we term mutual enlistment, but is sort of a different word given the military context for enrollment, asking how the academic research community and the military funding agencies are mutually enrolling or enlisting people or each other in their own agendas. The DoD wanting better warfighting technology, or at least higher tech warfighting technology, or alternately to sort of build up the technological base of the United States, and the research community wanting to enroll, obviously get funding for whatever they want to do. Sometimes sort of the DoD ends as an afterthought, sometimes as like fully buying into that mission. I'm actually currently rereading Closed World by Edwards. Some of us might be familiar with it, but it's a wonderfully wide-ranging book, but in particular for us, it traces the rise of cognitive psychology and reconstructing both humans and animals as cybernetic machines and digital computers. So cyborg discourse, especially through the Cold War, really tracing militarism through technological development throughout the Cold War period. And think about especially command and control. And today, more contemporarily, a growing body of critical research, including Lucy Suchman's, challenges sort of the way in which AI and tech-enabled targeting systems and other ways of sort of seeing, quote unquote, the battlefield are turned into a justification for genocidal acts, and particularly right now, genocidal acts in Gaza. Next slide, please. A little bit about our technical methods, and I'll ask Sireesh as well to fill in a little bit here. This project started as a scraped data set from grants.gov, a government-run repository of grant solicitations for a bunch of, hi Lily, you just a bunch of grant solicitations across the US government, not just the DoD. I will point out these are solicitations, not funded proposals. So solicitations is an agency going, hey, we want research to do this, and the proposal is the researcher going, we will do that. Here's how we're going to do it. So we're looking specifically at the government side of this, how in this case we filtered it down to 7,000 US military grant solicitations for AI. In this case, this is the Department of Defense going, we want research to do this kind of thing. We want AI research to do this kind of thing. Who will propose it to us? If you download 7,000 PDFs onto your computer, even a very powerful computer like laptop, it will crash. You cannot search them very well. So we developed a few different technical methods to allow us to better interpret this data set in a sort of a critical technical practice that we call interpretive computational analysis. Computational, we're using computers to help us. We can't read 7,000 documents, but it's still interpretive in that it's guiding our own sort of internal interpretive practices. And this is a 17-year data set, so we can see how things change over time, which we'll talk about a little bit. We constructed an LDA topic model, which allowed us to find solicitations or chunks of solicitations that speak to AI in particular, or different applications or different kinds of AI. We repurposed a graphical user interface called Elasticsearch that allowed us to better search and filter this large amount of text data. And Sireesh also performed DB-scan clustering on the titles for these grants, which basically just allowed us to better see trends, or rather a series of grant solicitations. If a title is very similar year on year, that's a good chance that it's just changing the year, and it's part of the same series reissued every year. Anything you want to fill in there?
Yes, just two things I want to add. I think the focus on interpretive computational analysis is really important here. While a lot of these methods are computational, ultimately we are not using kind of quantitative methods or like numbers to justify the analysis that we're doing here, right? These tools are solely to enable an interpretive analysis, not to supplant it or even complement it, really, right? These things are really tools to help us think rather than to present our results. But the other thing that I want to talk about is in building these tools, I think our focus was twofold, right? There is the kind of targeted, I know what I want to look for aspect of search, but there's also an aspect of this where we really wanted to enable ourselves to find things that we did not know were in the data set, the kind of unknown unknowns, as it were. And so with things like DB-scan clustering and that LDA topic model, a lot of what that enabled us to do was find corners of the data set that we did not know existed, right? If we did not know that AI was discussed in certain ways, those kind of unsupervised methods, i.e. places where we didn't need to label data or know what we were looking for ahead of time, helped us explore corners of the data set that we did not know existed.
Yeah. Next slide, please. So next slide again. So for folks who, I was going to say, are not in the US and don't know how the US federal research system works, or really doesn't work lately. But I think actually most folks in the US also don't know how it works, including researchers themselves. So here is a very brief refresher. The Department of Defense represents 41% of all federal expenditures on research and development. So a big chunk of that pie is from the DoD. Next slide, or click. Within that, there's different categories of Department of Defense funding. In this paper, we're zooming in on what's called 6.1 basic research. That is, and then it sort of goes 6.2, which is applied, more specifically targeted to a specific thing. And basically, the further you get 6.1, 6.2, 6. Whatever, you're getting more and more into the realm of like this. We are contracting you to build this specific system with less sort of research, unbounded research, and more specifically targeted towards like development, or like, not just research, but actually developing a system. Next slide. And this is articulated, and basic research is articulated as essential to the Department of Defense's mission, even though it's sort of in various ways talked about funding, quote, basic science. It's also seen as a way to train science and engineers to enable the workforce needs of the national defense industries, as well as but also still making clear that it's not like every part of this research must be tied, at least officially, and we'll get into that, to a particularly military end. Next slide. Now at Carnegie Mellon, about half of our research budget, half of our research expenditures come from the Department of Defense and the Department of Homeland Security. That's essentially the border force. Fully half. 49.3% or something. Next slide. And this isn't exactly the same kind of category, but it's a similar one. This is divided into unrestricted research, which is what you can think of as normal research, stuff you're allowed to publish, stuff you're allowed to talk about, and restricted research, that which the Carnegie Mellon, as a case study here, does allow research that is not allowed to be public to occur in some instances, including federally funded research and development labs, which develop things like Crusher. This is a military robot here. We're still not at Carnegie Mellon. We're not allowed to put weapons on them, but we're allowed to put a mounting bracket on them that might have a weapon on them one day. Next slide, please. And some labs at Carnegie Mellon sort of have an explicit statement saying, we don't accept military funding, even basic research. Next slide. But during my time at Carnegie Mellon, this was the broad sentiment I got. I only take basic research funds, so it's not ethically problematic, and not sort of thinking further. I'm only accepting 6.1 basic research. I'm only I'm only doing, basic science, fundamental science, even though it's DoD funded. Therefore, I have no particular ethical obligation to stay engaged with how it might be used. And that's the question we want to problematize here. Next slide. Click. Yep. So first of all, here I'm going to unpack how the notion of basic research is still nonetheless entwined with military needs. So on one hand, the Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship, which is a grant series we studied, says that it funds basic research without specifically applications or products in mind. Ambitious blue sky work here. Click. Next slide, please. But such work must be related to the long-term national security needs. So we're seeing basically, yeah, it's for ambitious blue sky research, but still somehow scoped, and still with the goal to create long-term relationships between university and the DoD. And even though these programs, it says, quoting here, have built a rich tradition of technical innovation with many important engineering applications for the Air Force, is still, they sort of articulate this nonetheless as remaining the goal remaining the advancement of basic science that serves as a foundation for technical progress. So we sort of have this, blue sky, basic science, but still sort of scoped towards military needs. So hope y'all tuning in didn't miss the funny cloud there, which I thought was appropriate for this slide. Next slide. Here we also have, instead of just being scoped, we might have basic research that isn't particularly scoped. Like, it's not said you have to do related to long-term security needs. But we often saw the language, for example, the frequent use of the word warfighter in place of the word user. So we're seeing solicitations for basic research that are nonetheless described in terms of war. Fundamental research in neural activity, for example, to facilitate the integration of warfighters and future AI agents, still basic research. Also, naval air warfare and weapons, expeditionary maneuver warfare, and warfighter performance, all, quote, basic research. We also have programs, or at least I don't know if we still have these programs, but there used to be a lot of funding to equalize a lot of solicitations designed to equalize funding between predominantly white institutions in the U.S. and historically Black institutions in the U.S. One's so essentially an equity program to allow broader access to federal research funding, and one of those was looking for environmental sensing of the battlefield, for example, in support of field artillery. So even though we have, next slide, please. So basically, basic research can include that research specifically designed to enable, quote, artillery targeting very explicitly. So even though you might be working on, I don't know, mathematical equations, it's very clearly articulated that this basic research could be used, or is an example given as artillery targeting. Next slide. Sometimes, actually, these categories are blurred between basic research and applied research. What I call basic research or applied, whatever, we don't care. Just give us the AI, please. For example, we have a project designed to fund the Internet of Battlefield Things. I'm already terrified enough about Internet of Things, so Internet of Battlefield Things doesn't make me much happier. We have, next slide, we have basic, and what this sort of then functions as is basic research becomes an on-ramp to more applied specific work. In many cases, the solicitation says that we're going to fund this under 6.1 basic research, but depending how it goes, if we really like what you do, there's this other separate pot of money as an enhanced program, quote unquote, designed to really enroll, next slide, enroll, socialize, and sort of enroll proposers, researchers, and socialize them into thinking of DoD needs. And next slide here. Here is a manifesto by a computer science professor, I actually believe in Texas. Funny, because I might end up there. Saying how, yeah, this can be a slippery slope. Like, I don't accept any military funding, including that for basic research, he's saying, because of this particular on-ramp, because often basic research is positioned explicitly by the DoD as an on-ramp to more applied, more particular, more weapons-oriented work. Next slide. Um, so we also, even not in particular proposals, we see different documents and other artifacts used to signal what is interesting to the DoD, even if it's not actually coming with the promise of money or promise of funding. We see various letters to colleagues designed to draw attention to research areas, particularly language processing or and this is particularly scary to me, language processing to allow machines to check whether commander's intent matches the rules of engagement, which what this ends up amounting to is an automated system to check that you're allowed to shoot at the thing ethically under the laws of war. Not where I'd prefer to use automation, as well as design challenges, which aren't particular promises of funding necessarily, but basically one of them is unmanned aerial vehicle challenges, where basically a school is said, or a collection of schools are given a goal, a broad challenge, unmanned aerial vehicles, and said, see what we can do here. And it's sort of a call to action, a call to compete for this particular goal. We have a few at CMU as well. And down to the right weird, which really actually isn't necessarily signaling beyond funding, but one of the weird solicitations we found was a call for research on how smell works, including via mathematical modeling techniques, supposing that similarly smelling army units may have better loyalty and cohesion. In short, what does a good army unit smell like? How can we use AI to tell? And yeah, can we make sure that they smell correctly? A little bit of levity in this serious topic. And now I'll hand it over to Sireesh to talk about what a basic research solicitation actually looks like.
Yeah, so to get into it, I want to talk about, kind of in the weeds, what does a basic research solicitation look like? And what can you expect to find in one of these solicitations? And I think the three adjectives that I'd use to describe what a basic research solicitation looks like are broad, evocative, and interdisciplinary. What you're trying to go for here as someone that is writing a solicitation for funding is something that really inspires the imagination, brings unrelated fields together, because, in the words of someone I talked to after this paper, the more disciplines you can involve, the more potential funding that you can apply to this problem. And you also want to really provide a lot of jumping off points for researchers to do work that may be interesting to them. And so the examples that I have here on the right focus on the kind of interplay between biological and AI technologies, right? So the top quote talks about how we need to both understand the central role of memory in the brain and also instantly translate that into something that can improve ML capabilities. You also have this kind of really interesting analogical interplay between biological systems and computational systems, where properties of computational systems like efficient learning, i.e. the use of very little data to learn a pattern, is assigned to octopi, right? You can say that octopuses are really good at efficient learning, and they're good at few-shot learning, which are really terms of discourse that arise because of the affordances that machine learning models present. Right, few-shot learning is interesting because of the historical need for a lot of data for machine learning models. But if octopuses can do it, why can't machine learning models do it? And why can't your basic research solve that problem? Similarly, we have the idea that the top-down mechanism of visual attention in primates has resisted complete analysis. But in the scope of this 3 to 5 year grant, we both want you to understand that and also apply it to AI. Right? There's this idea that all of these concepts live in the same space and are ultimately translatable to each other in a 3 to 5 year grant, which if you talk to the people that fund this research, they also don't believe this. But the idea is that you want to be evocative to get to an idea that this is something that you could theoretically do, to allow you as a researcher to steer the DoD, but within the parameters of the kind of war scope that David talked about a little bit earlier. And to get into an example of that, I actually wanted to talk about one of the grant series that we talked about a little bit earlier, the Vannevar Bush Faculty Fellowship. This is one of the more prestigious fellowships that are available to young career faculty through the DoD. And David talked a little bit about how it is primarily framed in terms of motivating blue sky research. And I want to talk about, where AI occurs in that basic research right now. So we start off with a number of areas. Area 1 here is applied mathematics and computation, and it talks about how applied mathematics and computation might enable abstract reasoning that match or exceed that of humans. Reasoning as a topic is super interesting. We're not getting into it as part of this talk. It's just something to put a pin in and maybe discuss in the Q&A. But it's also worth noting that Area 1 here also points out that AI more properly belongs in Area 2. Area 2 here is networks and artificial intelligence. It is explicitly focused on artificial intelligence, and it calls for novel approaches in machine learning and artificial intelligence. However, it also notes that artificial intelligence is covered in topic 3. Topic 3 here is neuroscience and fundamentals of cognition and intelligence. And one of the really interesting moves that we saw in this data set is the increasing prominence of AI over time, right? So this area actually occurs in multiple solicitations over the course of years. Vannevar Bush has been going since about the mid-2010s or so. And the interesting thing to note in this solicitation is that AI is now mentioned in the first paragraph of the topic soliciting basic research for neuroscience and fundamentals of cognition. Before, it used to be primarily that the neuroscience and cognition came first, and then eventually you'd mention something like a brain-machine interface or AI. However, what you see here is that now the entire framework for understanding cognition and intelligence is now put in terms of designing revolutionary approaches to artificial intelligence instead of, say, warfighter support, which we saw in earlier years. Area 4, mercifully, we do not have an AI focus. However, we get to Area 5, quantum information science, and once again, we see machine learning rearing its head. We also miss Area 6, but in Area 7, material science, you also see that machine learning has a kind of required call-out. We also had areas 8 and 9 where it's not mentioned, but it is worth noting that in about 5 of 9 areas of the solicitation, many areas of research not explicitly related to AI has been brought up as this kind of shiny new technology that all of these things must be compared to. And the way we conceptualize this is that AI has effectively become what we call a durable frame, a rhetorical structure against which all other methods must be compared. And this is something that happens repeatedly through this data set. We have earlier examples, like the incidence of network science. In the Area 2 research that I talked about before, you see that artificial intelligence is actually conceptualized in terms of networks, right? So in the space of the grants that we have looked at, networks as a durable frame is kind of giving way to AI as the framework with which you must think of all things. You also see it in places that you'd expect, like networking structure dynamics and protocols, which uses network theory to actually study, how computer networks work. But you also see it in places that you might not expect as much, like from Minerva grants, which are a series of grants that fund social science. We see that we use dependency network analysis to identify relationships for conflict mitigation. And this is one of the frames mentioned in that grant solicitation, but network analysis really is a thing that spans multiple disciplines and becomes a framework for how the DoD thinks about research more broadly. Coming back to the ideas from Closed World and cybernetics, an earlier example of this is also control theory, right? Where we talk about things like machine learning and artificial intelligence in the late 2000s and early 2010s, we see that all of those artificial intelligence technologies are framed in terms of control theory. All of the affordances of artificial intelligence technology must be compared to affordances of control theory in a way that says that control theory is the kind of dominant frame with which the DoD thinks about these things. So in the top case, we have a multidisciplinary grant from the Multidisciplinary University Research Initiative, or MURI, that talks about learning decision architectures, i.e. AI technologies, that must rely on control. Secondly, we see an instance from 2010, which talks about information collection and fusion, or how you integrate information from different sensors at different granularities. At this point, this is conceptualized almost entirely as an artificial intelligence task. This is something that you feed to an AI model that is trained for something like that. But we can see here that this is still, it's still required to be framed within control theory and information theory. So AI has become this kind of basic frame, but I want to take a step back and talk about one of the rhetorical moves that we identified here and talk about why AI makes such an interesting frame for the analysis that we're doing here. Sorry. So one of the things that we saw in this data set is a repeated use of a rhetorical frame that we call one small problem. Right? And that is where you introduce a research task and you instantly say, oh, but this research task was insufficiently conceptualized, or it was designed in these very limited conditions and it doesn't work in more real world conditions, and your basic research can solve that. So in this example, you see that game theory is being talked about as the study of how emotionless geniuses play games, but it ignores how average people with emotions and limited foresight play, right? However, it's worth noting that despite this limitation, this is still seen as a call for the continued research on game theory, right? The kind of one small problem is seen as a motivation for further research rather than as an actual blocker. Similarly, in this example from 2021, we talk about how reinforcement learning, a type of machine learning that is used in kind of many real world cases, is useful for chess and Go, but for problems of practical interest, they might not converge, or they might not actually be useful. This is a similar case where this is actually calling for funding of reinforcement learning in ways that make it more applicable. Notably, with AI, one small problem is a significant rehabilitation, right? As recently as 2018 and 19, AI was seen as impractical, not in the one small problem way of this is impractical and therefore we need you to study it, but impractical and will not be considered competitive. So the example that I have on the screen here talks about automated technical document comprehension, which by 2024 standards is firmly within the remit of what you'd expect AI to be able to do. But it's worth noting here, it talks about how AI ultimately does not create a semantic representation, and ultimately that statistical correlation and big data only approaches are not considered competitive. This is not a one small problem framing, but it is this is such a big problem that we cannot consider funding this. However, as we get into kind of later years, as we get into kind of 2020, 2021, we see that that framing shifts over time, right? You see things like the success of autonomous cars on US roads has created a lot of excitement in the DoD. However, it's worth noting that in 2020, we get articles like this, which point out that in 2020, there are actually no self-driving cars being tested on US roads, right? It is seen that the progress on these self-driving cars has largely stalled out. Notably, they also say things like machine learning, when used as an enabling technique in vision planning or knowledge representation, improves overall effectiveness. This is provided kind of citation-free, unlike what we see with control theory or information theory, where existing military successes can be used to justify the continued research into these things, despite their perceived one small problem, lack of real-world capability. They then qualify this by going on to say that this machine learning can be defeated by minute perturbations of the input or training data used. So this really raised the question for us of why is AI so inevitable when its value is so unclear? I'll hand it back to David. You're muted, David.
Right at 40 minutes. So on that sort of question, which I think we all probably pose in a variety of ways, but we have posed now in the context of military, which at least before doing this project, I saw as a much more like proof is in the pudding type organization. We'll conclude and just briefly restate a few of our main points. We have some and invite questions. So we've seen how we've seen the mutual enlistment or mutual enrollment of the DoD, the Department of Defense, and academic AI. The DoD enlists academic researchers in its agenda through funding, but the academic community also enlists the DoD in its agenda by painting new AI technologies as inevitable solutions to DoD problems. We've seen the one small problem frame, how quote problems with research are often seen as not a detriment, but actually the motivation for future research rather than real obstacles. We've also, and to me, this is the main takeaway that I yell to my compatriots at CMU who don't want to think about basic research or ethics thereof, of basic DoD research. It's always targeted towards wartime use. They're not giving you big buckets of money for nothing. Here are some links to both this paper as well as the two background works that we led with that sort of informed how we each came to this work. And with that, thank you so much for your attention, and we'd love to take questions. I see we already have one hand raised.
Thanks both so much for that. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's we'll jump straight in with Lily's question.
Okay. Hi there, and thank you so much for organizing this series, Patrick, and for doing this research, David and Sireesh. Yeah, I really appreciate this, and I'm sure I'll have more kinds of questions later. But on the durable framing, I was kind of wondering if, like, it sounds like the durable framing kind of is more focused on the rhetoric of these grants. There's a concept in science studies from Joan Fujimura called the bandwagon, which is about like she's describing like biological research regimes and the ways that like biological research goes through waves where a bunch of researchers are focused on like one particular paradigm or like one particular way of like understanding and like, intervening in and restudying biological systems. And so that's, she calls that the bandwagon, but it's not just rhetorical, it's also infrastructural, because bio research, like you need certain kinds of tools to conceptualize cells in a certain way, like computational tools, wet lab stuff, companies that supply the materials. And so like the bandwagon, it like points to like an infrastructure that the whole like scientific like wave relies on. And so I was wondering if this like growth of AI if there's like infrastructural aspects to why it grows in dominance. Like, the military is already invested in a certain set of techniques, and maybe it has systems that are based on those techniques. And so funding research that can interface with those techniques, with those computational infrastructures, is like more viable for them to roll into applied research, for example. Yeah, that's kind of the question. Thanks.
This is a great question, and I hadn't heard of that research, but I will definitely go back and look it up. This is actually a major focus of the background paper that we talk about, the Contextualizing Paradigm Shifts paper, that talks about what we call a software lottery, derived from Sarah Hooker's notion of a hardware lottery, of you do the research that has the infrastructure to support it. Right? In machine learning right now, what that looks like is you are doing exclusively things that are designed to be run on kind of GPU hardware, and that work well with the GPU hardware that is currently out. And we also see that in software, right? Like you've seen this incredible concentration on large language models and transformers that is self-propagating because of the software infrastructure that has been built up to study it. And I think the interplay between the kind of military and civilian spheres is really interesting here, because things like technologies like self-driving cars, for instance, really come out of this era of kind of GPU intensive compute and centralizing on certain ways of doing things in software, right? Like there are certain ways to conceptualize of how a self-driving car will work. And I think what we're seeing here is the military really borrowing heavily from both corporate and academic imaginaries of what that looked like, that are kind of very heavily circumscribed by corporate investments made in those zones.
Yeah, exactly what Sireesh said. And the paper he was referring to was the one in the bottom, Paradigm Shifts in NLP. Just to briefly add on, thanks, Lily, for your question. I think the rhetorical move works in part because of the infrastructural investment. To say that's, we've done all this great work and it's working well except for this one small problem, is to reify the idea that what we've done so far and all the infrastructure we've built for it is working, except for this small thing that means we need to keep working on it. And so the rhetorical, I mean, it might be true, but often it might be not, that one small problem will not actually fix the thing. But to acknowledge that would be to sort of give up on all that infrastructural investment, to sort of, it would be saying the scary part out loud, the quiet part out loud. So basically, I think the rhetorical move rests, as you quite rightly, as Lily asked and then Sireesh answered quite rightly, depends on that collective faith in the infrastructural investment to pay off, whether or not it actually does. Lily, does that speak to your point?
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Stuart, please.
Yes, I'm Stuart Price, De Montfort University in the UK. Just building on the idea of rhetorical, what interests me in what you were saying is kind of from a discursive perspective as well, because it's very interesting how you frame the rationale that is being created in these societies, in these funding regimes, to be able to get researchers to, to prevent them kind of thinking, well, this is immoral, basically. Is that what you're driving at? And to what degree do you think that this is working? I've seen a few other presentations in the past which address that issue specifically, about how strange it is that people working on particular research projects that will definitely be used for kind of military or repressive purposes, how there's that kind of elephant in the room about the morality of it. So just on that point, on the rationale, does your research touch upon that stage where the researchers themselves are kind of refusing the fence, failing to add, two and two together to make four? I'm just very interested in the mindset of, because we see it, don't we? And there's research on universities as, academic, military, industrial complexes. So just that issue about those people doing the research and the rationale. Do they think it through? Are they committed to it, or is there some kind of moral problem that they have to overcome? Thanks.
Yeah, and so a lot of good stuff in there, and just starting with like, um, do how it, I guess to your first point, I see this paper not as investigating the mind state of folks who make the claim, oh, I'm just doing basic research, therefore I don't have to think about ethics or fundamental science, and therefore I don't have to think about ethics, because that is the mind state that I saw by and large at Carnegie Mellon. Um, so this is the thing I want to I mean, talk about why I was excited to work on this paper. I wanted something to be able to really think through and send to those colleagues so that, look, like, I have my own views on basic on military funding, and I hope not to accept any. Actually, I have before when I was an undergrad, not really thinking too hard about this stuff, but I hope not to in the future. But my main plea to folks exercising that form of disavowal, I'm just doing basic research, I don't have to think about ethics, is to stay engaged with and to think about the downstream impact of what it might be used for. And we see a variety of ways in which that I would call ignorance is maintained, whether through this simple, it's basic research, therefore it's not connected, to, oh, it's dual use, it has these wonderfully beneficial uses that I think about a lot. And then I give demos to the military guys, and I don't know what they use it for, or something. And so there's just various ways I ask folks to stay engaged with this work. I think there's more to your question, though, and I'd also love Sireesh to get a chance to respond from his own experience.
Sure. No, that's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah, I will say from my perspective, as someone that is on military funding, I think that I also see a kind of range of responses to being on military funding, where I think I've certainly also seen the state of kind of, I only do basic research and therefore it's not a problem, to, where I am, where I am on military funding, but I see that as a position of compromise. In research atmosphere where, overall 41.8% of research is DoD funding, I think that is significantly higher in certain areas of computer science, for instance. And so for me, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance of, I'm doing research that supports, material science for engine components, but at the same time, I go to the kind of end of year presentations that David mentioned, and we get a military guy being like, you guys are doing great work, I'd love to bring it into the lab and shoot at it. So there's a lot of, I think there's just a lot of cognitive dissonance there. And I think this paper really aims to explore the kind of underlying facts that should power that.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, any other questions, thoughts? Do feel free to raise a hand. I might just jump in to ask a question as well here. I think it's really interesting that, at the opening you mentioned kind of the closed world imaginaries, and that the Edwards kind of theorization of that. And I just wondered if you could maybe expand upon how perhaps firstly that theory itself, but then actually how you kind of see that as forming part of the outcomes of this research in terms of the relationship between kind of I guess, like Edwards' theory and this kind of basic versus applied distinction, and I guess the creation of a certain kind of like discursive framework around this work. But yeah, I don't know if you could just speak maybe to the role of closed world imaginaries, particularly David, as you're rereading it currently.
I said I was rereading it, not that I was rewriting the paper yet. That comes next. But thanks for the provocation, and I guess I thinking out loud here, I'd start with it's almost like, I don't know, there's this weird, at least in my experience, sort of quote closed world with like we're in science world, the funding comes in, but yeah, and the points of permeability where I'm interested in sort of widening and forcing those points of permeability where we might help folks in that closed, pure science research world think harder about those. And those can be sort of the language as we've sort of analyzed here in the solicitations themselves. Those can be maybe when you find out who's citing your work or who's doing what with it. Maybe that can be yeah, maybe just more, maybe those can be the actual sit-ins that my colleagues have been kicked out of school for organizing with military contractors, sort of these provocations that allow that world to be punctured. Now, more broadly, I think there is a sort of closed world dynamic going on with the military seeing academic research as part of its fiefdom. But I'm not. I would want to think more about that, and particularly the subjectivities that entails, as I'm loving the Edwards book for getting into. Yeah. Any thoughts? Welcome here, Sireesh or Patrick as well.
Maybe just another question as well would be, I know this is the paper's kind of really focused on the military academic interconnections. I'm wondering as well, like particularly within the US context, about the role of like big tech within this kind of constellation. I know it's not kind of really touched upon in this article, but I'm wondering how, even a similar kind of your methodology could be applied within that context to see the kind of interconnections there as well.
That's a great question. I think, for us discussing writing this paper, the big tech connection was really the elephant in the room, where unfortunately, I think this data set that we were using as the field for our research, unfortunately did not have references to that, right? Like there's not a lot of kind of interplay between big tech and academia in that these grants that we were looking at were specifically designed or aimed at academic research specifically. But it's worth noting that, DoD funding for private research is also a huge industry, right? Like small business grants are a huge part of how a lot of startups keep themselves alive, in lieu of, actual paying customers, which I hear in AI are pretty hard to come by. And so that the scope of, kind of DoD industrial stuff is something that I think we wish we could have looked at. But I think more pressingly, there is also the sense in which the terms of discussion of AI are being set by, industry players in terms of how these problems are being thought of, right? So if you look at kind of like large language models or self-driving cars, many of these are kind of industrial priorities that have shaped NLP and AI more broadly in the way that we discuss in the kind of prior work, and show up, as implicit latent factors in a lot of the solicitations that we look at. Of just like, industry has demonstrated this, therefore we're soliciting academic research that furthers that aim.
Yeah. My broader goal, not in this work, but in future work, is to find ways to get at evidence of corporate use or evidence of corporate funding in academic work. I guess we're kind of, we're lucky here because public records laws mean that these things are quite nicely organized on grants.gov and they're public. It's not public when Palantir might give money to a researcher to fund research, necessarily, unless it was at a public school. So thinking more about that, it's certainly less sort of codified and organized.
Thanks so much. Lily, please.
Yeah, with the military research following industry, I'm not super, detailed in my like information about how it used to be, but I kind of had the impression that it used to be more that the military would create a lot of basic technologies. Like the Mariana Mazzucato argument of the entrepreneurial state is like basic research is like funded by the government and then consumerized through industry and venture capital. So
yeah.
And like Meredith Whittaker has that like steep cost of capture article that's like actually industry is the only one has enough data to forward a lot of this research. So like, is there a flip happening now where actually like the military is following industry, at least in this kind of data intensive computation area? And then how does that affect us?
I think so. I think that truck remains kind of two-way in that I think the distance that we've seen in terms of industry commercializing things that are initially funded as basic research, I think was like a huge trend that happened for a long time. And I think we're seeing a little bit of the collapse of that as especially Silicon Valley pivots back towards explicitly military ideas, with companies like Anduril, with like the kind of prominence of drones and the way that VC is pivoting towards funding explicitly like jingoistic military companies. That said, I think the distance that the kind of consumerization provided is something that is allowing industry to influence the military in a way that I don't know that we did see before. And I think that comes in this kind of embrace of big data and technologies that provide very little guarantee in terms of what they actually do. So one of the things that I was really interested in looking at this data set is when you look at the kind of durable frame of cybernetics and control theory, the conveniences and the affordances of cybernetics that are always emphasized as being useful is behavioral guarantees, right? Of I can quantify the uncertainty with which this algorithm will do something. And machine learning is not that, right? If you look at the kind of stuff in 2018, 2019 that we're talking about, there are no guarantees for what a machine learning model will and won't do. And it's worth noting also that the kind of continuity of a cybernetic imaginary of just, we're doing this, we're getting this feedback, we will update in real time, is broken by these machine learning technologies, many of which are, trained once off every 6 months, and it'll be like, oh, this is my knowledge cutoff or whatever. And so there's a lot of ways in which I think machine learning as a tool is particularly badly suited for the military in that it provides no behavioral guarantees in kind of high stakes situations. It provides estimates of performance that are ultimately not estimates that are, developed on the task that you care about, which is, I think, one of Lucy's papers recently talks about the kind of conflation of machine learning performance and targeting performance. And so, yeah, I think it does influence the military in ways that are less precise because the technology is coming from an area of consumer technology where precision is not necessary per se, right? Like if you screw up an ad recommendation, that's not a big deal. If you screw up bomb targeting, that is a big deal, but the technology is so popular that it's hard not to do that.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
felt crappy.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lily, go ahead.
I was just saying, like that was really clarifying, like the kind of the the incursion of like a very different set of requirements for precision or guarantees, as you call it. Sorry, yeah, David, go for it. That was just really helpful.
No, just briefly adding, I think I also, this might be overly reductive. This certainly is overly reductive, but kind of the way I think of it is the military still has a lot of the money that's going to these startups, that going, these small business grants, which we don't analyze necessarily here, but we're looking more at money going to academics. So that continues as historically we might expect. But the flip for me is more rhetoric of like the hype machine is the tip of the hype machine are the companies, either saying that something can be done when it can't, or saying it's just around the corner for each year for 20 years or something, or saying, look, we built this thing and it works and it does do the thing but it doesn't do it very well. So basically I think there's like sort of the material contribution, that the money from the DoD is sort of in the same in the direction it often has been, but the sort of leading edge of the hype rhetoric is coming more from companies and sort of their own innovations.
Yeah, I do want to add just like one more thing here, which is, I was at the kind of like quarterly review meeting for the grant that I'm on, which is funded by the Army Research Lab and focuses on kind of material science. And one of the things that still sticks out to me that I still think about is, the Army scientist that was funding this grant was like, oh, we have to do this well because the big dogs are getting involved. And he shared a slide from one of Satya Nadella's keynotes about trying to compress the next 100 years of material science into the next 5 years or something like that. And I think for observers of tech companies in particular, that is empty rhetoric, right? I think there's a kind of flag planting that big tech companies do that is entirely unmoored from real consequences in the world, because for them, it's a shareholder game, right? It is important that your shareholders think you are doing something, regardless of its impact on the bottom line, in the kind of like weird hypey bubble that we live in right now. I think for the military, that is less the case, right? I don't think the military has shareholders that hype can energize in the same way. It is much more, tied to real world things. And so I think the uncritical acceptance of tech industry hype at face value is something that I'm still thinking about it. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know how to, push back against that. But it's also like the technology is bad, but it's also just like you're taking these assurances about like, this technology is going to do something that is clearly impossible at face value.
Thank you. Super interesting.
Thanks both. Thanks so much for your responses, and thanks, Lily, for the question. Perhaps if there's not any more additional questions, I'll just kind of ask a final, I guess, kind of broader question from David and Sireesh. And I guess this is, I think thinking beyond the scope of this paper in particular, but, I've been attending some, AI lab events, particularly related to like military applications of AI technologies. And I just wonder if you're seeing a shift now towards more critical perspectives within kind of computer science, within the computer science space, because it's not my area at all. And I'm wondering if, with the, ongoing genocide in Gaza, as a kind of inflection point for I think, thinking about the kind of ethics of AI military research, not to say that it wasn't happening before, but I wanted to get a sense of an insight maybe from both of you about how you see that landscape changing. Is there much more work that's being done now on kind of like critical reflections and into the ethics of this work, or do you kind of feel like that's not happening nearly as much as it should even still?
There's a lot in this question, I think. And I think there's a stratification that bears talking about, because I think this kind of reflection is happening more in the community, but I think it is happening at the same time as, a kind of misdirected response is happening. So I think there's like a spectrum that I'd like to address here. And on the one side of that spectrum is the people that see kind of the increasing military use of AI and are just like, great, I'm going to go do that now. Right. I think there was an article it was in a local San Francisco newspaper about kids at Stanford who have transitioned in the course of their degree from being like, I will never work for a military company, to, explicitly conceptualizing national security as the thing that they want to orient their career around. And that is, national security with all the baggage that attends that term. And so there's that side of it, of just like, I think that this is explicitly a good thing and I want to do it. And this is kind of seen as a kind of a growing up moment for some of this technology, of just like, oh, it was designed to serve ads, but I can use it for something, like meaningful and important, with, again, heavy qualifications around meaningful and important. I think there's also a number of people that see problems with the use of AI in contexts like these, but have straw men like, AGI or, like Rocco's basilisk to fall back upon, to say there is danger in this, but the real danger is AI taking over and not, the immediate dangers that we see today. And I think there's also a group of people that are looking at, the impacts that happen today. And I think that is a critical movement that is growing, but it is happening against the headwinds of people that both acknowledge this and think it's fine, and acknowledge this and think it is not the real problem.
Yeah, I'll also add, it seems like for those who are having some kind of awakening right now, it seems like it's seen as like now is seen as is discontinuous, as a juncture with the past, as something that, rather than sort of a natural elaboration of what and of what has been going on for a while, which isn't which we've talked about. And so that leads to a certain like ahistorical nature of the response of like, oh my goodness, these are uncharted times. And I mean, uncharted in degree, maybe not in kind. The other thing I'd say also, oh wow, interesting. The other thing I'd say also is this comes in the context. So even if that critical nature is there, this comes in the context of huge cuts to research funding across the board, politically motivated cuts to research funding across the board, including to the way our universities are often funded, which is like indirect costs or overhead, a portion of the grant that goes to running the lights and paying the janitors and such. And so this leads to sort of this culture of scarcity and austerity, like, oh my God, I'd love to have any funding, no matter where it comes from, even if it's from the DoD to build AI-enabled killer robot. You know what I mean? So I think that it cuts both ways. Like these tumultuous times for some are like actually sparking a critical awakening, so to speak, and for others, it's sort of the thing that doubles down on the grant seeking behavior.
Yeah, I think that's that both really great points, and I think it's worth bearing in mind the flip side of the current political climate in the US, and I hadn't considered that as a kind of an opposite kind of logic that might begin to start operating now in terms of scrambling for anything you can kind of get your hands on. And yeah, that's a fantastic point. But I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along today, and to thank David and Sireesh once again. Really appreciate you taking the time. And if you're both able just to hold on for a second as people drift out, I'll just wrap things up. But thanks again so much, and thanks everyone for your contributions and questions as well.
Questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and thank you for the questions.
Bye. Thank you for the organizing.